The screen is white, not empty, not calm white, like a storm that refuses to end. The wind howls across the Colorado mountains, carrying snow like knives in the air. Somewhere in that blizzard, hidden beneath layers of ice and rock, tiny hearts are beating fast. A litter of wolf pups, barely a few months old, huddles together in a crevice, their breaths shallow, their survival measured by minutes. We are in the middle of Colorado's wolf reintroduction program, where every year biologists carefully release 10 to 15 wolves into the wild. The goal: rebuild a population of 30 to 50 wolves, strong enough to restore balance to the ecosystem. But no plan can predict the fury of nature. And this winter, nature strikes with one of the most brutal snowstorms in decades. As the storm rages, a faint signal blinks on a ranger's screen, anomalous weak, almost drowned out by static. The GPS collars placed on the wolves are designed to tell stories without words: movements, pauses, danger. Tonight, the signal is erratic, frozen in place. Something is wrong. Inside the ranger station, men and women in heavy coats crowd around the monitor. Their faces are lit not by fire, but by urgency. One ranger leans closer, pointing. "They're not moving," she says. Her voice cuts through the noise of the wind slamming against the windows. Another ranger answers, "If those pups are trapped, they won't last the night." The decision is made. Despite the storm, a rescue mission begins. Snowmobiles roar to life, headlights cutting through whiteout conditions. Each mile forward feels like defying the mountain itself. But somewhere out there, beneath the weight of snow, lives are waiting. The camera follows the snowmobiles vanishing into the storm, swallowed by white silence. Their mission: to find and save a litter of wolf pups before the night takes them. What happens next will test not just skill, but courage, and the outcome will surprise everyone. What happened next shocked everyone. Before the storm, before the frantic signal on the GPS tracker, there were people, ordinary people bound by duty to extraordinary creatures. Colorado is not just a state of wide skies and tall peaks. It is a land of conflict and compromise, where cattle ranches stretch across valleys, and predators once hunted here have only just begun to return. To understand this night's rescue, we must first meet those who risked everything to carry it out. Ethan Reyes had been a ranger for 12 years. Born in a small town at the base of the Rockies, he grew up with stories of wolves, most of them told in fear. As a boy, he heard ranchers mutter curses at the very mention of wolves, blaming them for lost calves and restless nights. But as he grew older, Ethan studied wildlife biology, drawn not to the myths, but to the science. He learned the truth: less than 1% of livestock losses in Colorado came from wolves. Disease, accidents, and weather claimed far more. And yet fear had always outweighed facts. That tension had defined his career. Ethan was tall, with a steady voice that rarely broke under pressure. In the ranger station, colleagues trusted his judgment. But beyond his calm exterior was a man still haunted by questions. Could humans ever truly share the land with wolves again? Beside him on this mission stood Marisol Vega, a wildlife veterinarian who had joined the program 2 years earlier. Marisol carried the precision of a surgeon and the compassion of a mother. She had seen too many wild animals suffer from preventable causes: poaching, vehicle collisions, starvation. For her, the reintroduction program was not just science, it was redemption. Every healthy wolf that returned to the wilderness felt like a personal victory. Marisol was small in stature, but her presence filled a room. Her quick hands had treated everything from fractured wings to mangled paws. Tonight, though, she would face a challenge that tested not just her skills, but her endurance against nature itself. And then there was James Whitaker, the field coordinator, whose job was to connect the dots: science, law, and logistics. James was pragmatic sometimes, blunt, always carrying a clipboard filled with forms. He knew every regulation tied to wolves, how far they could be transported, how long they could stay in a holding facility, when and where they must be released. To him, wolves were not only animals, but ambassadors, caught in a delicate balance between ecological need and political debate. Together, these three formed the core of the rescue mission. But around them was an entire network of local volunteers who had learned to track in deep snow. Technicians monitoring signals from laptops, drivers ready with vehicles warmed and waiting. Each person played a role unseen but critical. The land itself was both ally and adversary. Colorado's mountain ranges carved valleys where elk herds grazed, where rivers cut through forests of aspen and pine. Wolves had once roamed here in packs, shaping the balance of prey and predator forest and field. But by the mid-20th century, relentless hunting had erased them. Now, decades later, the reintroduction program sought to undo that absence. Each winter brought new challenges. Storms could erase tracks, freeze rivers solid, and bury dens under snow. Yet it was precisely in such harsh seasons that the strength of wolves shone brightest. They thrived where others faltered, except when they were very young. Wolf pups without the warmth of a den or the protection of a pack could not survive alone. The ranger station where the mission began stood at the edge of one such valley. Built of timber and stone, it was both rugged and functional. Its windows frosted with ice, its roof groaning under snow. Inside, maps covered the walls marked with red pins for wolf sightings, blue lines for rivers, green circles for potential release zones. The air smelled faintly of wet wool and coffee, evidence of long nights spent waiting for signals just like the one they had received tonight. For Ethan, wolves represented a chance to right an old wrong. For Marisol, they were fragile lives that deserved every effort. For James, they were symbols of policy science and fragile public trust. And on this night, their worlds collided not in a classroom, not in a courtroom, but in a blizzard where survival was counted by the minute. As the snowstorm thickened outside, the rangers tightened their boots and strapped on headlamps. Radios crackled with updates, their voices strained but steady. Each one of them knew what was at stake. Not just the lives of wolf pups, but the credibility of the program itself. Losing a litter to the storm would not only devastate the wolves, it would fuel critics who argued that reintroduction was doomed to fail. Ethan zipped his coat, looked at Marisol, and gave a nod. She returned it with quiet determination. James snapped his clipboard shut. The time for paperwork had ended. The time for action had begun. The station doors opened. The storm swallowed them instantly, snow blasting against their faces. Behind them, warmth and safety. Ahead, uncertainty and peril. Three figures on snowmobiles disappeared into the night, bound by one purpose: to reach a den of wolf pups before time ran out. The mountains had a way of hiding secrets. Every ridge, every shadowed hollow could conceal a story, sometimes of survival, sometimes of loss. On this night, the search for the wolf pups became a race not just against the storm, but against time itself. The snowmobiles carved their path through drifts taller than a man. Headlamps lit only a few feet ahead, the rest swallowed by swirling white. Radios sputtered their signals, flickering with static. Still, Ethan pushed forward, eyes fixed on the faint red dot pulsing on his handheld GPS. Each pulse felt like a heartbeat, reminding him that somewhere ahead, life still flickered. They reached the edge of a rocky outcrop where wind tore at the trees and snow piled into jagged ridges. Ethan signaled to stop. The GPS screen froze, the dot no longer moving. Marisol leaned close, her voice raised over the wind. "This is it. They should be here." The team dismounted, boots sinking into snow. They moved cautiously, scanning the rock face. Storms erase sound, But tonight, a faint noise cut through a whimper, sharp and desperate, carried on the wind. Marisol froze. "Did you hear that?" Ethan nodded. He raised his hand, signaling silence. The whimper came again, higher this time, thin and fragile. It was not the call of an adult wolf, nor the growl of a predator. It was the cry of something small, afraid, and still fighting. They climbed toward the sound, hands gripping frozen stone snow pelting their faces. The cry led them to a narrow fissure in the rocks, half buried under drift. Ethan knelt, brushed away snow with his gloves, and peered inside. Darkness. Then, two small eyes glinting back, glowing amber in the beam of his headlamp. Marisol gasped softly. "They're here." Inside the crevice, huddled together, were 4 wolf pups. Their fur was matted with ice, their tiny bodies pressed tight for warmth. One limped, dragging an injured leg. Another shivered so violently that its whimpers shook the cave walls. For a moment, the storm vanished in their minds. There was only this fragile sight, life balanced on the edge of extinction. Fear was the first reaction. Fear of approaching too close. Fear of what might happen if the mother wolf was nearby. But the GPS confirmed no movement from adult wolves in the area. Likely separated, possibly dead in the storm. The pups were alone. Compassion followed quickly. Marisol's heart clenched as she reached for her medical pack. Ethan stopped her with a steady hand. Slowly, he warned. "They're still wild. We can't frighten them." He removed his gloves, letting the warmth of his bare hand extend toward the entrance. His breath fogged in the air, his movements calm, deliberate. The pups tensed ears, twitching, small growls rumbling from their throats. But hunger and cold had drained their fight. When Ethan placed a piece of soaked cloth near them, damp with milk replacer, the smallest pup sniffed, then licked. That was the moment the balance shifted. Fear gave way to trust. Marisol crawled closer, wrapping a blanket around the weakest pup. Its body felt like ice, its heartbeat fragile beneath her fingers. She whispered softly, not words, just sounds of comfort. The pup whimpered once more, then stilled its breathing steadier. James, standing guard, kept scanning the tree line with his flashlight. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust sounded like a predator. He knew that while they saved the pups, they themselves were vulnerable, exposed in the middle of a storm. With each pup lifted carefully from the crevice, the storm seemed to grow harsher, as if nature itself resisted. The smallest one whined weakly. The injured one struggled when touched. Marisol examined its leg, frostbite, maybe a fracture. She pressed her lips together, hiding her worry. Ethan carried 2 pups inside his coat, their tiny bodies pressed against his chest for warmth. Marisol cradled another, whispering encouragement. James secured the 4th in a padded crate. Each movement was measured, deliberate. Any mistake could cost a life. The team gathered at the snowmobiles, their breaths ragged, their faces raw from cold. Ethan looked at the pups, then at Marisol. "We need to get them back now." Marisol nodded. "They won't last long out here." But the storm had other plans. As they mounted their snowmobiles, the wind shifted violently, blinding them. Snow cascaded down the slope, an avalanche threat. The path back was blocked. James cursed under his breath. "We're not getting through that." Ethan scanned the ridge, thinking fast. Another route lay to the east, longer, riskier, but passable. He pointed. "There. We move now, or they won't make it." With no time for debate, they turned their machines and pressed on, carrying not just wolves, but the fragile weight of hope. In the heart of the storm, 4 wolf pups now had a chance. But as the rangers pressed into the night, the blizzard was not done with them. And what awaited on the eastern ridge would push both humans and wolves to the very edge of survival. The storm did not ease. It clawed at every inch of the mountain, bending trees, hurling snow like shards of glass. For Ethan, Marisol, and James, the path eastward was punishing. Snowmobiles groaned under the weight of riders and precious cargo. But inside coats and crates, 4 wolf pups clung to life. By the time they reached a forestry outpost, an abandoned cabin used for fire patrols, the team was near exhaustion. The cabin was crude, just 4 walls and a roof sagging under snow, but it offered shelter. Ethan forced the door open, a gust of powder sweeping inside. They hurried in, setting lanterns on the table, turning the small room into a sanctuary of light against the storm's fury. Marisol laid blankets on the floor, spreading them like makeshift nests. She unwrapped each pup carefully, checking them one by one. Their fur was soaked paws, stiff eyes half closed from fatigue. The smallest pup barely stirred. "Hypothermia," Marisol whispered. She rummaged through her pack, pulling out thermal pads and bottles of milk replacer. Her hands moved quickly, but gently. Ethan helped by rubbing the pups with cloth, trying to restore circulation. James fed wood into the rusted stove, coaxing flames to life. One pup, the injured one, whimpered when Marisol touched its leg. She examined it under lamplight, swollen cold to the touch. "We'll need x-rays when we get back," she murmured. "But for now, splinting will have to do." She tore strips of bandage, improvising a brace. The pup growled faintly, a reminder that even in weakness, its wildness was intact. Marisol smiled softly. "That's a good sign." Hours passed in fragments. Feed, warm, rest, repeat. Ethan cradled 2 pups against his chest, feeling their tiny heartbeats thrum like fragile drums. Marisol coaxed the weakest one to drink from a bottle drop by drop. At first, it refused, jaws clenched, but finally, hunger won. A swallow, then another. Relief swept the room like heat. James, usually all business, found himself kneeling by the crate, watching the pups twitch in sleep. "They're tougher than they look," he muttered. Ethan chuckled quietly. "So are we." But the storm outside did not relent. Wind howled through cracks in the cabin's snow, rattled the windows. The team knew they might be trapped for hours, maybe days. Supplies were limited. Every ounce of food, every stick of firewood mattered. As dawn broke faintly, the weakest pup's breathing faltered. Its tiny chest rose unevenly, each breath a struggle. Marisol's eyes widened. She pressed her stethoscope against its ribs. Silence between beats. "Not good," she whispered. Ethan leaned close. "What do you need? Oxygen? Fluids? Things we don't have here." Her voice cracked, the weight of helplessness heavy in her chest. She rubbed the pup's side, whispering encouragement, her voice trembling. "Stay with me, please." Ethan looked at her, then at the stove. He grabbed a tin can, filled it with snow, and melted it into warm water. He soaked cloth in it, placed it against the pup's body, creating crude warmth. Marisol improvised with sugar and salt packets from her emergency kit, mixing an oral rehydration solution. They dripped it carefully into the pup's mouth. The pup coughed weakly at first, then stronger. Its chest lifted, fell, lifted again. Marisol's shoulders sagged with relief. "Come on, little one. Fight!" That night, as the storm roared outside, something changed inside the cabin. Fear gave way to quiet determination. These were not pets, not possessions, but in this fragile window of survival, humans and wolves were bound by something deeper, shared struggle. Ethan found himself staring at the pups as they slept, their tiny bodies curled in the warmth of blankets. For a moment, he imagined what it would be like if wolves never returned, if the valleys remained silent. He shook the thought away. These pups were proof of possibility. Marisol sat nearby, exhaustion etched in her face, but her hands never stopped moving, adjusting blankets, checking pulses. James dozed against the wall, but every creak of wind snapped him awake, flashlight in hand. Hours bled into a second day. The storm outside began to break, pale light spilling through the cracks. When Ethan opened the door, he was met not by blinding white, but by silence. Snow piled deep, but skies beginning to clear. Marisol checked the pups one final time. Their eyes, brighter now, blinked back at her. The injured one even licked her finger before curling back into its blanket. She smiled. "They'll make it." James clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "We survived the night. So did they." But survival was only the beginning. The pups needed transport to the wildlife center where proper care awaited. And beyond that, decisions would need to be made when, how, and if they could return to the wild. The cabin, once a place of desperation, now echoed with fragile hope. 4 wolf pups had fought through the storm, and in doing so had begun to weave an invisible bond with the humans who saved them. Yet outside, the world still waited, full of questions, conflicts, and challenges far greater than the storm they had just survived. The storm had passed, but silence in the mountains was never simple. Beneath the calm, danger lingered. The rescue team had endured the night the pups had survived their first brush with death, but nature had more tests to give. When Ethan opened the cabin door that morning, a blinding light poured across the valley. Snow lay thick, sculpted into drifts as high as rooftops. The air was brittle, the kind that burned the lungs with every breath. To the east, dark clouds still brewed threats not yet spent. James scanned the horizon, his expression grim. "Avalanche risk is high. This snow is unstable." Marisol pulled her coat tighter. "Then we don't linger. The pups need the wildlife center." Ethan nodded. "We move carefully, but we move." They loaded the pups once more, 2 tucked into Ethan's coat, 1 resting in Marisol's arms, the injured one cushioned inside James's crate. Their breaths puffed tiny clouds against the frosty air. For a brief moment, it felt hopeful, but mountains are unpredictable. As they descended along a narrow ridge, the ground beneath them trembled. A low groan, deep and rolling, echoed across the valley. Ethan froze. He knew that sound. "Go!" he shouted. A crack split the mountainside. Snow roared like thunder, cascading down in a wall of white. An avalanche, merciless, unstoppable. Snowmobiles revved, but the ridge was too narrow, the wave too fast. Abandoning the machines, the team scrambled downhill on foot, clutching the pups to their chests. The avalanche chased them, tearing trees from roots, swallowing rocks whole. Marisol stumbled, nearly falling. Ethan grabbed her arm, yanking her forward. James shouted directions, voice lost in the roar. They ran not for victory, but for survival. The avalanche struck the lower slope, snow exploding around them. Ethan shielded the pups with his body thrown sideways by the blast. Marisol tumbled into deep snow, clutching her pup desperately. James disappeared in a blur of white. When the world's stilled silence fell heavy, snow blanketed everything, reshaping the mountain. Ethan gasped for air, clawing upward. He pushed through powder, one arm cradling the pups against his chest. They whimpered, alive. Relief surged through him, but there was no time to rest. "Marisol," he shouted. A muffled cry answered. 20 feet away, Marisol struggled, half buried. Her arms held tight around the pup, refusing to let go. Ethan crawled toward her, every movement sinking him deeper. With brute effort, he pulled her free. She coughed, face pale but determined. "I've got him," she rasped, holding up the pup, still trembling but alive. But James, there was no sign of James. Ethan and Marisol searched frantically, calling his name. Minutes stretched like hours. Then a weak voice broke the silence. "Here." They found him partially buried beneath a broken branch, the crate wedged against his chest. Inside, the injured pup whimpered faintly. James groaned, clutching his side. "Ribs. Think they're cracked." Marisol checked quickly. He was hurt but conscious. The pup inside the crate had survived, shielded by James's body. Together they dragged him free, every movement agonizing. Snow crunched under their knees, breath steaming in the cold. Above the ridge loomed unstable, another slide possible. They had to move. Step by step, the group limped toward a stand of pines where the snow was thinner. Ethan carried 2 pups. Marisol, one, and James, though injured, refused to let go of the crate. They collapsed beneath the trees, gasping. Marisol leaned against a trunk, her voice trembling. "We almost lost them. We almost lost you." James winced but managed a weak smile. "But we didn't. That counts." Ethan looked at the pups nestled and breathing, their fur warming against him. In that moment, the line between human and wolf blurred. They were all survivors of the same storm, bound not by words, but by the instinct to protect. The avalanche had stolen their machines, but not their purpose. With James injured, travel became slower, more grueling. They built a sled from broken branches, lashing it with straps from their packs. Ethan and Marisol pulled. James lay flat, clutching the crate with the injured pup. The trek was brutal, every step sinking into waist-deep snow. Yet even in suffering, small moments glowed. One pup, stronger now, peeked its head from Ethan's coat ears, twitching at the sound of wind. Another licked Marisol's gloved finger, a fragile gesture of trust. The bond had deepened, wolves and humans carrying one another through the storm's aftermath. By nightfall, distant lights appeared the ranger station, weak, flickering, but real. The sight lifted their spirits. Exhausted, battered, and half-frozen, they dragged themselves and their fragile cargo inside. In the span of a single day, they had faced a storm, fought death, and outrun an avalanche. But the greatest challenge was still ahead. The pups had survived nature's wrath, but now they would face the scrutiny of society, laws, politics, and decisions that no storm could bury. The mountain had tested them with snow and avalanche. But once the storm subsided, another trial emerged, one far more complex one that no survival instinct could solve. At the Wildlife Center, the 4 wolf pups were placed in heated enclosures, monitored around the clock. Vets checked their vitals, set bones, and administered fluids. Within days, the pups gained strength. Their whimpers became playful growls, their eyes clearer, their movements steady. For Ethan, Marisol, and James, the sight was a reward for every bruise, every frozen mile. But outside the walls of the center, the story spread. Newspapers ran headlines, "Rangers rescue wolf, pups during blizzard." Photos of the fragile animals wrapped in blankets touched hearts and reignited old arguments. Some saw heroes, others saw trouble. Ranchers across Colorado voiced their anger. At diners, at town halls, on radio shows, their voices carried the same refrain: "Wolves don't belong here. They kill our livestock, threaten our way of life." At one meeting, a rancher slammed his fist on a wooden table. "You're saving predators while we bury our calves. Who saves us?" Another stood and argued back. "Science says less than 1% of losses come from wolves. The rest is weather illness. Wolves keep the ecosystem balanced, elk herds, deer populations. Without them, the land suffers." The debate split communities. For every voice defending wolves, another demanded their removal. And now, with a litter rescued in plain view, the question grew sharper: should they be released, or should they remain in captivity? Beyond the public, the law had its say. Federal and state regulations governed every step. Wolves were protected under reintroduction protocols. They could not be raised as pets, could not be exhibited without permits, and must be reintroduced once healthy. James knew these rules better than anyone, yet he also saw the weight they carried. In a meeting with state officials, the tension was palpable. "The pups are recovering well," James reported, "but they need more time before release." An official adjusted his glasses. The longer they stay, the greater the risk they imprint on humans. We cannot allow them to lose their wild instincts. Marisol countered, her voice firm. Without extended care, the injured one may never survive in the wild. Are we releasing them to thrive or to die? The room fell silent. It was a question with no easy answer. Ethan found himself torn between science and sentiment. He had carried the pups through storm, and Avalanche felt their tiny hearts beat against his chest. Yet he knew they were not his to keep. The wilderness was their birthright. But was the wilderness ready for them? Was society? He walked the pens, often watching them grow stronger. They tumbled clumsily over each other, learning to nip, to howl, to test their muscles. When one pup lifted its head and gave a shaky howl, Ethan felt his throat tighten. The sound was both fragile and defiant, a promise that wolves belonged here. Protests began outside the center. Signs read, "Stop the wolves." Others countered with, "Save the wolves." Media cameras caught the clash of chants. Inside staff felt the weight of eyes upon them. Every decision scrutinized, every action politicized. Ethan hated the noise, but he knew it could not be ignored. Public trust was as fragile as the pups themselves. Marisol faced criticism too. Some accused her of coddling predators, while others hailed her as a guardian angel. She brushed off insults, but in private, the burden showed. "I just want them to live," she confided to Ethan one night. "Why is that so hard to accept?" He had no answer. By week's end, the debate reached a boiling point. Officials demanded a timeline for release. Ranchers threatened lawsuits if wolves returned near their herds. Conservationists pleaded for patience, warning that premature release could doom the pups. Caught in the middle were Ethan, Marisol, and James, 3 people who had risked their lives to save these animals, now forced to defend them not against storms or avalanches, but against human doubt and fear. The pups played in their pen, unaware of the storm outside the walls. But soon, their future would be decided not by nature, but by people. And the choice would test the very soul of the reintroduction program. The blizzard had passed, but a new storm had begun, made of voices, laws, and the clash between fear and hope. The question now was simple but heavy. Would the pups be returned to the wild, or would human hands decide otherwise? Weeks passed, and the wolf pups grew. Their coats thickened, their legs strengthened, their eyes sharpened with the wild glint of instincts returning. They no longer whimpered for bottles. They gnawed at bones, wrestled one another, and tested their voices in small howls that echoed down the corridors of the Wildlife Center. For Ethan, Marisol, and James, watching them change was bittersweet. Each day brought joy, proof that their rescue had worked. But each day also brought a reminder: wolves were not meant to stay here. Their place was beyond fences, in the forests and mountains where their ancestors once roamed. The official's decision arrived in an envelope marked with the state seal. James opened it with steady hands, though his jaw tightened as he read aloud. Upon full recovery, the pups are to be released at designated reintroduction sites. Rehabilitation may not exceed 60 days to minimize human imprinting. Marisol exhaled, her shoulders heavy. 60 days, she repeated, after everything. That's all we get. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. We knew this was coming. His voice was calm, but inside his chest ached. The next weeks became a blur of preparation. Biologists trained the pups to hunt small prey in controlled settings. They scattered carcasses for the pups to find, taught them to associate human presence with distance rather than comfort. The wolves adapted quickly, wild instincts flickering back into dominance. Marisol often stood at the edge of the enclosure, watching them chase one another, pounce, clumsily stumble, and rise again. Each leap, each playful snarl was a reminder that they were leaving soon. "They're ready," Ethan said one afternoon as the largest pup let out a confident howl that startled the others into joining. Marisol smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "I know. That's the problem." The morning of release was clear sky, a brilliant blue over snow-blanketed peaks. Trucks lined the ranger station, their cargo quiet but restless. 4 crates each carrying a wolf pup now nearly grown. Their eyes gleamed, their bodies pressed against the bars, sensing change. The team gathered scientists, officials, volunteers. But for Ethan, Marisol, and James, the world narrowed to those 4 crates. Marisol crouched by one, fingers brushing the wood. "You fought so hard," she whispered, though no one else could hear. "Now it's time to fight on your own." James, still nursing cracked ribs, but refusing to stay behind, leaned heavily on a cane. He touched the crate carrying the pup he had shielded during the avalanche. "You and we've both got scars. Wear yours well." Ethan stood a moment longer silent. He remembered carrying them against his chest, feeling their faint heartbeats, hearing their first cries. Now those same wolves pressed against the crates with restless strength, no longer fragile, no longer helpless. The convoy wound its way into the mountains, where meadows opened beneath ridges thick with pine. This valley had been chosen carefully. Ample elk herds, running water, minimal human presence. Here wolves could carve their place again. At the edge of the clearing, the crates were set down. The air was sharp, every breath laced with pine and frost. Cameras whirred, officials murmured, but Ethan, Marisol, and James barely noticed. Ethan unlatched the first crate. Silence held for a heartbeat. Then the door swung open, and a gray-furred wolf pup bounded out, no longer a pup, but not yet full-grown. It landed in snow, hesitated, then bolted toward the trees. Its howl echoed once before it vanished into shadows. The others followed each release, both joy and heartbreak. One limped slightly, the pup Marisol had nursed so carefully. Yet, when it ran, determination carried it forward, tail high. When the last pup emerged, it did not run immediately. It stood snow, clinging to its fur-golden eyes fixed on Ethan. For a long moment, time seemed to stop. Ethan's throat tightened. He whispered, "Go!" The pup tilted its head, then lifted its muzzle and released a howl high, strong, startling the valley into silence. It was not a cry of fear, but of recognition. A farewell, a memory carved in sound. The howl echoed off the cliffs, carrying miles. Then, with one last glance, the pup turned and sprinted after its siblings, disappearing into the forest. Marisol wiped a tear quickly. James whispered, That was for you." Ethan only nodded, unable to speak. The wolves were gone, returned to the world that had nearly taken them. The valley was quiet again, but the silence carried weight. For Ethan, Marisol, and James, it was both an ending and a beginning. They had saved lives, but more than that, they had given the wilderness back a piece of its soul. The forest had swallowed the wolves, but their story did not end at the clearing. In the weeks and months that followed, their howls carried across the valleys of Colorado, reminders that the wild was not gone, it was returning. Biologists monitored the pups through GPS collars, each signal a heartbeat on the map. They watched the wolves travel farther each week, testing rivers, climbing ridges, learning the contours of their new world. The limping pup adapted, running slower, but keeping pace. Against odds, it survived, proving resilience stronger than injury. For Ethan, those signals became more than data. Each movement confirmed that the choice to let go had been right. At night, he would check the trackers from his cabin, tracing the wolves' paths across mountains. He imagined them hunting elk, playing in snow, learning to fear and respect the world as wild creatures should. Marisol returned often to the center where other animals awaited care. Yet her mind drifted to the pups. She remembered their frailty on that first night, their trembling breaths. To see them now roaming free was proof of why she had chosen this path. One evening she stood outside under the stars. In the distance, faint but distinct, a wolf's howl rose. It cut through the silence like a thread binding past and present. Her lips curved into a soft smile. "They made it," she whispered. For James, the aftermath was less poetic. Reports landed on his desk. Livestock killed, ranchers demanding compensation, conservation groups pushing back. Every wolf howl was also a political ripple. At one meeting, a rancher raised his voice. "You release them. You pay for our losses." James responded calmly, though fatigue lined his face. Compensation programs exist, but wolves are part of this land's future. Balance means cost and benefit. Though tired, he remained steadfast. He remembered the pup in the crate, the one he shielded under avalanche snow. For him, the wolves were not statistics, not line items on reports. They were survivors, creatures that deserved more than fear. Public opinion shifted slowly. At first, protests flared, but then stories spread: elk herds thinning naturally, forests regenerating, rivers running clearer as ecosystems recalibrated. Science spoke louder than fear, though never without opposition. Children wrote letters to the center. "Thank you for saving the wolf pups." Teachers brought classrooms to learn about predator-prey balance. For many, the pups became symbols not of danger, but of resilience. One crisp autumn morning, Ethan hiked into the valley where the release had taken place. He carried no equipment, this time no crates or trackers, only himself. Leaves blazed orange and gold, crunching underfoot. At a ridge he paused. Below, movement stirred, shadows slipping between trees. Wolves, larger now, stronger. They moved with confidence, no longer the fragile pups he had held against his chest. One wolf lifted its head, ears twitching. For a moment, golden eyes locked with his. Recognition flickered, faint but undeniable. Then the wolf threw back its head and howled. The others joined their voices, weaving into a chorus that filled the valley. Ethan stood still, his chest tightening. It was not a farewell this time, but an affirmation they belonged here. And so did he in his small way as their guardian from afar. The blizzard had nearly taken them. Human debate had nearly divided them. But in the end, the wolves endured because people chose compassion over fear, science over myth, resilience over surrender. Marisol once said, "I just want them to live." They did. And more than that, they reminded everyone that life in its wildest form cannot be caged. It must be given space to run, to howl, to heal the land that birthed it. James, despite the weight of laws and disputes, admitted quietly one evening, it was worth it. Ethan said nothing, only listening as a distant howl carried across the mountains, a sound older than history, yet reborn that winter. The storm had passed, the valley healed, and the wolves roamed again. Their howls became the echo of survival, resilience, and a fragile promise that even in a world of doubt, there is room for wildness. And in the memory of one storm, one cabin, one avalanche, 4 wolves carried forward, a legacy greater than themselves, proof that life, when given a chance, always finds its way back home. Every story leaves behind a lesson. For the wolves of Colorado, the lesson was not carved in law or shouted in debate halls. It was whispered in the snow, carried in howls across the ridges, and written in the bond between humans and 4 fragile pups that should not have survived. The first lesson was science. Fear painted wolves as relentless killers, but data told another truth. Less than 1% of livestock losses came from them. By understanding this, by using guard dogs, fencing, and carcass removal, ranchers and wolves could coexist. The rescue proved that coexistence was not fantasy, it was measurable, practical, and real. Science had always said so. Now people had lived it. The second lesson was compassion. The pups' survival did not depend on charts or policies. It depended on human hands willing to try. Compassion bridged the gap between fear and trust, turning predators into symbols of resilience. Without compassion, the storm would have claimed them. With it, they ran free again. The third lesson was courage. Ethan, Marisol, and James stepped into the teeth of a blizzard, risked avalanches, and faced down public anger. Their courage was not reckless. It was deliberate, the choice to protect life when it would have been easier to look away. Courage made the difference between silence and howls echoing again through the valley. The wolves were not saved to become pets or trophies. They were saved so the land could remember its balance, so rivers and forests could heal, so future generations could hear the wild chorus of howls under a full moon. And the humans. They too were changed. Ethan learned that letting go was sometimes the bravest act. Marisol discovered that healing was not only medical, but spiritual, giving animals back their freedom. James understood that laws are not chains, but bridges built carefully between people and nature. Together, they showed that saving 4 pups was about more than survival. It was about proving that humanity and wilderness are not enemies but partners in a fragile shared future. The story of these wolf pups reminds us when we choose fear, we lose both wolves and wilderness. But when we choose knowledge, compassion, and courage, we give life another chance. Colorado's reintroduction program is not just about wolves, it is about us. About whether we can live in balance with the wild, about whether we are willing to protect what can